Do you want me to share my journey?
Yes.
Oh, yes, I will. I was born in Jamaica, in Kingston. Interestingly enough, 3 months before the start of the Second World War. And my father was a pharmacist, in those days called a druggist. Not, you don't use those words these days. And he had he had the pharmacy shop in a very small village town called Frankfield. And he was very keen on education, very keen for education for my sister and my older brother. Unfortunately, my mother died when I was 7 years old. And my father remarried this wonderful woman whom we called Mamsie. And Mamsie realized that we needed to have a good education. It was very difficult because my father was a very sort of important person in this small town. And it looked almost as if it was it wasn't right to move me out of state school, in which classes were 65 children in a class, to a private school, but they did. So I went to this wonderful school. And I really want to stress this because that's really the beginning of my awareness about inclusiveness, about the fact that everybody matters in our lives. This school was founded on a Baptist foundation, but it was interesting, very tolerant, very open. So we went to COV churches at the weekend on Sundays. We would go to the Methodist church and the Baptist church. The girls of the Baha'i faith went to their services. The Catholics went to their services. So here I was in a boarding school amongst a range and variety of girls and all girls. And my role model was Dorothy Parsons, who was my head teacher. To think, to think that a head teacher in 1951 could stand on a platform and say to girls, you can be anything you want. Just remember, the world is open to you. And when you look at the difference between 1951 and here we are in 2000, in 2020, it's a very long time. And I was brought up in that way, feeling that I could take risks. I could be anything I wanted. However, I left Westwood at, my father's money dried up just when I had finished the equivalent of GCSE. And Miss Parsons said to my father, we would like Yvonne to be a pupil teacher. So here I was teaching botany and English to the first formers, and unlicensed, untrained teacher. I came out of uniform and started wearing skirts and blouses. And I did that until I did the equivalent of A levels. And then what was I going to do? I wanted to be a probation officer. And the careers person said, sorry, you're too young. You need to do something before and then come back to us. So I applied to do teacher training. I was only 17 and a half, took the exam and passed. And I started teacher training at 17 and a half, became a teacher then at 20 and a half, started teaching at 20 and a half, in a wonderful school. I was so lucky and felt guilty because most of my year group, all the others who had trained, went off into country schools teaching in classes of 65. I applied to the school called Knox College, and as you can hear, built on the foundation of John Knox, Presbyterian. And Lewis Davidson interviewed me. I got the job. And this was a boarding school. So I became a house mistress and a teacher in the junior school. Absolutely fantastic. I remember Knox with great joy, and I'm still in touch with quite a number of people who taught there. After 3.5 years, I decided that I wanted to come to Britain to do a degree, because Knox College was in the country, 1,000 feet above sea level, absolutely gorgeous views, but no opportunity for me to do a degree there. So my plan was to come to Britain, do a degree, and return to Jamaica. And here I am 51 years later. Do you want me to go on? Hello?
Yeah. Yvonne, why don't you tell us a bit about when you came to the UK and how it was when you first became head teacher?
Yes, I came I had been writing to the London County Council from Jamaica from about 1961, because I wanted to find out whether I would be qualified to teach in England. And they wrote back and said, your qualifications, we will accept your qualifications, but you need to have an interview. So I came to England in 1963 on the 11th of August, 1963. And I always say to everybody, I came on a banana boat. It was really rather quite posh, really. It was a Fife's banana boat. The bananas were in the hold, and it had a capacity of about 103 passengers, and took, I think it was just over 2 weeks, and landed at Southampton. And that's where I began to feel nervous. Although it was August, it was cold for me, obviously coming from the tropics. And then I had to get the boat train from Southampton to the Waterloo. And I was absolutely amazed to see red brick buildings, the sort of half light, people who were rather reserved, even coming up in the train, nobody talked to anybody, very unusual. So I was being plunged in a completely different environment and atmosphere in that short space of time between Southampton and Waterloo. I then lived with my mentor, with Elizabeth, and I was an expat teacher at Knox. And she knew I was coming to London, and she said, look, come and stay with me. So I lived with her in the Camden area, and then had my interview, passed that, became what's called a supply teacher, which meant, of course, you took over in various schools for teachers who were absent, either from ill health or whatever. And unfortunately, they placed me in Battersea, although I lived in Camden. And I remember getting up at 5:30 in the mornings, shivering. Although, again, you see, it was August, not the sort of bright Augusts we've had here recently, with an A to Z and a bus map to try and get me down to Battersea, because you had to check into the divisional office. In those days, you didn't just ring up. You had to go and say, I'm here. Is there a school I need to get to? And if there was a school which needed me, I then had to find the right bus or the right train and get to the school. And I did this for well over a month, and nobody needed me, simply because I think it was very early in the autumn term, and schools were well staffed. But one of the things I felt was attitude of staff in the divisional office. I remember one woman saying to me, but you're Black. So I said, yes, but I am a teacher. I said, I came from Jamaica just last month. And nobody had ever described me in those terms before. In fact, when I look back, you see, in Jamaica, we didn't have a discussion about being Black. You just got on with your life. And it wasn't until I had done some history at Teacher Training College that the realization, the whole business of the slave trade and colonialization, I began to understand who I was. The story, however, goes on that my mentor unfortunately sprained her ankle, and she suggested that I I take her place as a supply teacher in this wonderful school in Swiss Cottage in London. And that began to be the making of me. I went there as a supply teacher long term. I then became a temporary terminal teacher. I then became a permanent teacher, and the head teacher wanted to keep me. There were some challenges. It was also a time of apartheid. And I remember having a boy in my class, or rather, I was allocated this class in this class, which I took over in September 1964. Yes, 1964. And he went to the head teacher and said, I don't want a Black teacher to teach my child. And lovely head teacher, Miss Heath, said, well, I'm sorry, I think you need to find another school for your child. The end of that story was that little boy had been also very unhappy. He lived a life where he was looked after by a housekeeper. And at the end of the year, I got the most amazing bottle of perfume from his dad, thanking me because, in fact, his child had thrived in my class. So those were some of the irregularities at that time. The story just goes on that my head teacher said, Yvonne, I think you ought to think about being on what's called the promotion list. In those days, you see, if you wanted to be a head teacher, you had to go through a series of interviews and also observation of your teaching. And there were three folds. So, for example, I was observed teaching by the inspector for the Inner London Education Authority. I think it was still the LCC in those days. And then I passed that. So I had another interview with Her Majesty's inspector called HMI and the inspector for the LCC. And I passed that. And then finally, an interview, and I passed that. So I was now, by the time we got to April 1968, put on this promotion list. And in those days, there used to be a monthly sort of gazette which went round to schools, naming all the people on the promotion list. And there I was. It meant now that I had the opportunity of applying for the headship of the school. And I did nothing about it. And my head teacher kept encouraging me. And I thought nervously, I think I will apply for Ring Cross Infants, because my strength was and is in the 3 to 7 year olds. As Piaget say, it's really that age, the exciting age of children. They learn, they're curious, they love reading, they love stories, just absolute fun. And that's the age group I liked. So I applied for Ring Cross Infants, and I was shortlisted from 6. And I thought, because I had first interview with the governors of the school. So then this meant I had to go final interview down to County Hall, which, by the way, is now a hotel with a lovely restaurant overlooking the river. And I went down, 3 of us were shortlisted, and we were interviewed. And after you are interviewed, you wait in this huge corridor full of history with a lot of wood in County Hall, nervously waiting. And the attendant came out and said, "Mrs. Conolly." And I sat there. I couldn't believe it. "Mrs. Conolly." And then I went back and I was offered the headship of Ringcross. And all hell let loose. There was no social media in those days, but the newspapers came in their hordes, interviews, photographs, some photographs cut out of newspapers and posted back to me with racist comments. They threatened to burn the school down, somebody did. And it was also the beginning of the Enoch Powell Rivers of Blood speech. So there was a sort of overt racist environment at that time. Fortunately, I was very well supported by County Hall and by my husband. And I took up my job in January 1969 at Ringcross School, having met the staff before, which I might add, was also a sort of multicultural, multi-ethnic staff. My deputy was from Australia, was Australian. I had 3 teachers who, in fact, one who was Pakistani and the other 2 who were Indian. And, I had a teacher who came from Ireland. So we discovered we had a lot in common. We may have been differently colored people, me being Black, but what did it matter? What was important was raising the quality of education in that school for all those children. And I also must add that that part of Islington where I got that headship was in a rather poor area. It was called a social priority area. I remember we had extra funds for developing programs for the children. And the school intake was a mixed one. Not many children of Caribbean origin at that time, but children from across other ethnic groups. What I didn't realize was that I realized that there were no books or resources, lacked any images of Black children. And that's one of the things as a team, the staff and myself as a team looked out for, because I actually impressed upon the governors of the school and the school that it was important that children saw themselves reflected in literature, in music, in songs, in poems, and that we were not afraid when they were doing paintings to use brown paint. It's amazing that I'm mentioning this now in 2020, but I really must impress upon listeners that in 1969, this was a real practical omission. The lack of people represented in all around, in the newspapers, on television, on radio. Children weren't seeing themselves and their families reflected in the way in which it's done now. So I remained at Ringcross for 9 years as a head teacher. And my hope is that it made a difference to those children in terms of learning the academic subjects. But I hope they learned something too about the emotional side of them, empathy and compassion and kindness. Because running along the curriculum this is what we also wanted to embrace and get children to understand, that kindness in the world to people, regardless of their race, color, background, is in fact an important attribute to being a good human being. I then went into the Inner London Education Authority, created a pioneer inspectorate called the Multi-Ethnic Inspectorate. Very, very interesting, because it's almost as if the Inner London said, you know, who are these children that we create schools for? My goodness, they look different. They're different colors, they're different languages, they're different faiths, they're different backgrounds, they're different cultures. Are we responding to this? So they created this pioneer inspectorate of 5 of us. I was encouraged by my district inspector to apply. I was doubtful that I really wanted to go in the inspectorate. But I was appointed as the primary inspector for multi-ethnic in the multi-ethnic inspectorate,
Yvonne,
along with others.
I think your story is amazing, and I could just sit here all day and listen, because I'm learning so much and how different things were. But we have so many questions we want to ask you, and I was wondering if some of the things that you're saying could be as part of our interviewing with Anne. Anne is here and she's ready. So Anne,
oh yes,
for everyone who doesn't know Anne, you need to get to know Anne. Anne Mariz, I knew I was going to get that wrong, is the editor and digital publishing director of TES at TES, and joined TES in 2012 and was previously editor of Times Higher Education. I will hand you over to TES.